There's some pretty good news in car sales in Australia, and there aren't many industries in Australia where there's a bunch of good news, but it is true in car sales. They are high and they are rising. And that strength is in fact part of what's now a reasonably long-running trend. By and large, there's been a lot of good news in the last couple of decades off a very simple fact. Cars are relatively cheaper than they used to be. And it's been quite a remarkable shift. You think of the average Australian earning the average wage. How many weeks, how long does it take them to save up to pay for a car? Now, in the mid-1990s, somebody who started saving every single cent they earned on the 1st of January would have to save all the way through to the end of October before they could afford a Commodore or a Ford. It's been a big change. These days, you would, the same worker, average wages, would only need to save through to that first week in July. This has been one of the more remarkable shifts in affordability in cars than you've seen around the world. And cars are now so affordable that Australians are buying them in numbers that we just haven't seen before. And of course, more recently, some of the factors that have helped that long-running trend in affordability became better still. Now, two things. One, interest rates have been falling, and cars are bought on credit by and large. And that is a really big lever for your sector. And the news there is good. Rates are down. And the other thing too is, of course, lots of cars are imported. And that's cheaper, other things equal, when the Australian dollar is higher. And as you know, 2 years now, the Australian dollar has been riding high, roughly 1-for-1 against the US dollar. And that combination, the dream duo for you guys of low interest rates and a high exchange rate has been a big part of what's been a very good business back. It has its challenges, but by and large, the underlying story is good. And the good news for you is that a lot of that continues. Have a look at this chart. We do forecasts of interest rates. This is the variable housing rate, as a good example. And it shows you a very simple story. Interest rates are likely to stay low for a couple of years. Now, look at that chart. They're not at the emergency lows that you saw through the global financial crisis. Australia's economy is not in a crisis. We don't need those lows. But the Reserve Bank is worried. The biggest single driver, sure, car sales have actually been quite a contributor to economic growth in Australia, but the big driver of growth has been those mega mining projects in Western Australia and Queensland and elsewhere. And you'll have seen those stories. We're spending a fortune, but it's not that far away from a peak in that spend sometime in the next year or so. And then it starts to go less, and the Reserve Bank says, well, look, it's been the biggest single driver of growth in Australia, these mega mining projects, but it's going to go away as a driver of growth. We need another growth driver, and so they're using the lever they've got control of, interest rates. They've moved rates low, and they'll keep them low for a while, because we face otherwise a pothole in growth for a while. And that, again, this is good news for you guys, not just for you guys, for a bunch of retail. Retail's been sick as a dog for several years now. Again, not car sales, but retail will pick up in response to those low interest rates. And so too will things like housing construction, for example. And why will they stay low for a couple of years? Well, that pothole as the mega mining projects wind down is likely not to go away fast, but there's another reason too. One of the things that's bad, by and large, for Australia's economy is good for car sales. That strengthens the exchange rate. And have a look at this second chart here. Our view is that the Australian dollar stays somewhere around 1-for-1 against the US into the middle of 2014. That, by the way, is not necessarily because of what's happening in Australia, but because of what's happening in the US, where they're printing money, and they're doing the same in the UK and Japan and to some extent in Europe as well. And that means investors are worried about those currencies, and they're searching out ones like ours, or the Swiss franc, or even to some extent the New Zealand dollar. Those are the ones riding high. And that combination, low interest rates, strength in the Australian dollar, a beautiful backdrop for the car sector and for car sales, and one that we expect to continue in the next couple of years. South Australia has great strengths in a bunch of sectors. It's got it in the likes of manufacturing, it's got it, for example, in wine, it's got it in defence-related industries. But each of those under a degree of pressure at the moment. And for manufacturing and wine, a lot of it's got to do with the Australian dollar. A high Australian dollar is good news for car sales, but it's bad news for some key South Australian industries. That's why this chart shows South Australia as a weaker growing economy in 2013. And it's interesting actually to look at that in a longer term context. Now, this other chart here shows South Australia's shares of Australia in terms of population, share of the economy itself, and share of car sales. Now, basically, in an Australia where the fast growth has been in the resource states, in West Australia and Queensland, your share is getting squeezed. But it's also been a surprisingly stable one. You know that the basic backdrop for car sales in Australia has been good and should remain good. That combination, the dream duo basically of low interest rates and a high exchange rate, good for you. But South Australia as a share of Australia will remain challenged. Yours has not been a fast growth state. It's unlikely to be a fast growth state in the next year or two, partly because the Australian dollar stays high. Across that period, that will be an offset, not a big one, but an offset for your sector to remember, lots of good news from interest rates and exchange rates, but some of that is also a bad news for the wider South Australian economy.